Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Montour. I'm a Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies and Indigenous Studies here at McMaster University. I want to thank Jillian and Bridget and everybody at Mills Library for organizing us today and presenting and locating Alix and having her present on the archives, the Pauline Johnson and Maria Campbell archives at Mills. Mills has always had a special place in my heart. As when I first came to McMaster University, didn't know anybody and hid out in the library for the first year pretty much and got to know it in its old incarnation before the restoration a long time ago. So it's always one of my favorite spots on campus. And the archive folks and everyone there has been a wonderful support of, for Indigenous literature and the research and the building of our Indigenous Studies program, now a department at McMaster. So thanks to everyone there. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alix Shield, here to speak to us today, virtually from somewhere in British Columbia. Good morning, Alix. Thanks for joining us so early. I first had the pleasure of meeting Alix a few years ago when she visited the archives to look at the Pauline Johnson and Maria Campbell material, which she'll be talking about this afternoon, and that since resulted in the republication of Legends of Capilano, which we'll be talking about the Pauline Johnson collection, as well as a contributed to a revised version of Maria Campbell's Halfbreed, both groundbreaking works in their time. So I will introduce Alix in a more formal way. Dr. Alix Shield is a settler scholar and lecturer in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Simon Fraser University. Alix completed her PhD in English at SFU in 2020 and was awarded an Emerging Open Scholarship Award by the Canadian Social Knowledge Institute in 2021. She recently published an updated edition of E. Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver, retitled Legends of the Capilano, with the University of Manitoba Press and members of the Squamish Nation in British Columbia. So without any further ado, Dr. Alix Shield.
Good afternoon, I guess, for most of the viewers. Good morning if you are joining me in British Columbia. And thank you so much, Rick, for the introduction. It's really nice to share this virtual space with you today. So as Rick said, my name is Alix Shield. I'm a settler scholar and lecturer in the Department of Indigenous Studies at SFU, located in Burnaby, British Columbia. I live as a guest, and that's where I'm coming to you virtually today on the traditional territories of the Hulkaminam-speaking Snuneymuxw First Nation. So that's in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. So I've titled today's presentation, Kwaskastahsowin, Put Things to Right, Conciliation in the McClelland and Stewart and E. Pauline Johnson collections. And I'm going to speak to you today about what it means to put things to right in the context of two 20th century works of Indigenous women's writing in Canada. So we'll be talking about E. Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver, first published in 1911, and Maria Campbell's Halfbreed, published in 1973. And my talk will reference materials from McMaster University's archives. To put things to right. So Kwaskastahsowin, the first time that I encountered this term was at the 2019 Indigenous Literary Studies Association conference that was held at UBC, University of British Columbia, on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nation. At this conference, where Métis author Maria Campbell gave the keynote address, she explained that there is no word for reconciliation in the Cree, Michif, and Soto languages, and instead that she prefers to use the Cree term, Kwaskastahsowin, which she defined at that time as to put things to right. Now, when I heard this term, I felt an immediate sense of connection to this word. It seemed to describe my own research goals in a way that I hadn't been able to put into words myself. With Campbell's permission, this term would become part of the title of my PhD dissertation, where I focused on case studies in Indigenous women's writing within the Canadian publishing industry. And it is the topic of my dissertation research. So I defended my PhD in 2020. It's the topic of that research that first brought me to McMaster's archives in 2017. And this was for a month-long research trip, and specifically to go through the E. Pauline Johnson and the McClelland and Stewart collections. Now, anyone that's familiar with the E. Pauline Johnson collection at McMaster knows that it is quite extensive. And so despite this, I was really only focusing on a specific research goal. So I was looking at materials relating to the final years of Johnson's life, namely her time spent in Vancouver when the book Legends of Vancouver came to be. So some background first. Legends of Vancouver is a collection of 15 short stories or legends written by Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk writer, poet, performer E. Pauline Johnson. Most of these stories are based on the oral stories that were told to her by Squamish storytellers, Chief Joe Capilano and his wife, Mary Agnes Capilano. Johnson, pictured on the far left, was a 20th century poet, performer, and writer from Six Nations territory near Brantford, Ontario. And she became known for her writing during the 1880s, when she was publishing often in Canadian periodicals and newspapers. She would spend the rest of her life traveling throughout Canada, the United States, and England, reciting her poetry. And during her performances, she would often gesture towards her mixed Mohawk and English background by wearing a buckskin dress for one part of her performance and then changing into a European dress for the other part. Johnson eventually retired from the stage in 1909, and it was at that point that she moved to Vancouver, BC, where she would spend her final years. So many of the stories that were published later in Johnson's life were based on her friendship with Squamish Chief Joe Capilano, pictured in the middle there. She first met Joe Capilano in London in 1906. So Johnson was there in London to perform her poetry, and Chief Capilano was there with a whole different agenda. So he was hoping to meet with King Edward VII to protest restrictions that were being enforced at that time over Indigenous land and fishing rights in British Columbia. When Johnson relocated to Vancouver several years after meeting Capilano in London, she continued a friendship with him. She would spend time with Joe Capilano and his wife, Mary Agnes, going on walks around North Vancouver and canoeing through the Burrard Inlet over to Stanley Park. Though Joe Capilano at that time had gained a sort of notoriety in Vancouver for his outspoken activism, Mary was also quite well known in the city. She would paddle her canoe across the inlet daily to sell fresh seafood at the Hotel Vancouver. So it was during these outings with the Capilanos that the Capilanos would share their Coast Salish stories with Johnson. And this was in a mix of the Chinook jargon, so a type of trade language, and English. So these stories are the stories that would eventually become the book Legends of Vancouver. So the stories were first published in the local newspaper, the Vancouver Daily Province, so that's pictured on the left, and also appeared in slightly different versions in the American women's magazine called Mother's Magazine, and that's pictured in the middle. In 1911, and at that time, Johnson had become increasingly ill from breast cancer. Her friends and her supporters gathered together to form a group called the Pauline Johnson Trust. And this was a group that gathered a selection of Johnson's published legends, the ones that had appeared in the Vancouver newspaper, together, and then formed the book Legends of Vancouver, pictured on the far right. And the idea behind this was that all of the proceeds from the sale of the book would then go to support Johnson and her medical bills. Now, it's important to note that the versions of the legend stories that appeared in the Vancouver newspaper were different from those that appeared in Mother's Magazine. So the newspaper versions were often only narrated by Joe Capilano. And I won't go into detail here about the structure of the stories, but generally they sort of start with a kind of a frame narrative where Joe Capilano or Mary Agnes is kind of introducing the theme of the story, and then the story is told, and then the narrator kind of revisits at the end of the story, kind of framing the actual story that takes place in the distant past. Now, the versions that were published in Mother's Magazine, on the other hand, often narrated by Maria Campbell, focused on sort of different themes. So themes relating to women, to motherhood, kind of more typical to the demographic of that Mother's Magazine readership. Now, if we look at these two versions side by side, and these are actually of the same story, although the title has been changed. They are telling the same story. Looking at them side by side, we can actually learn a lot more about each of the Capilanos' unique storytelling mannerisms and gestures. So it's important that we acknowledge kind of each individual person as a storyteller in their own right. But we know that the versions that were published in Mother's Magazine, in that middle image there, were not the stories that were selected for publication in the Legends of Vancouver book. So Legends of Vancouver has been in publication for over 100 years now, and as a result has appeared in many different editions, has been taken up in different ways by various publishers and editors over the years. As a researcher, I first came across this book in a course during my master's degree at Dalhousie. And as I continued learning from this book and learning more about its very unique publishing circumstances, I quickly realized that there was a pattern in all of these previous editions of Legends of Vancouver that in different ways neglected the storytelling contributions of both of the Capilanos. So of Joe Capilano, but especially of Mary Capilano. In my research, I also learned that Johnson had actually wanted to use a different title for the book, but that she had been quite sick at the time when the book was being put together, and that her wishes for the title of the book were not ultimately observed. So despite being published and republished as Legends of Vancouver for the past 100+ years, this is not the title that Johnson actually wanted for the collection. There are documents held in McMaster's E. Pauline Johnson collections that reveal that the early working title of the book was Indian Legends of the Coast. So you can see the image on the left here is an order slip. And that Johnson ultimately wanted the book to be called Legends of the Capilano, as a tribute to the Capilano storytellers and their community at Capilano Indian Reserve No. 5 in North Vancouver. The title that was ultimately chosen for the volume was, as scholar Linda Quirk suggests, quite misleading. So Quirk states, quote, "The legends in this collection are not about George Vancouver's explorations of the Pacific coast late in the 18th century, nor are they about the founding of the city of Vancouver in the late 19th century. They have nothing to do with the city of Vancouver at all," unquote. Now, pictured in the middle here is a letter that I also found at McMaster, and this was written by Pauline's sister Evelyn in 1913, so just shortly after Pauline's death. This is one of 5 letters that were exchanged between Evelyn and a Mr. James Goulet of Kent County, Ontario. Now, the letters that are held at McMaster only show Evelyn's side of the correspondence, but in reading through them, it becomes clear that Mr. Goulet started the correspondence to Evelyn to express condolences for Pauline's recent passing. Now, in this particular letter dated 1st of July, 1913, Evelyn writes, quote, The name Legends of Vancouver was given the book by the trustees of the fund in the hope that it would prove a better seller. My sister was greatly disappointed, as she had called it Legends of the Capilano, unquote. And I know that it's very difficult to actually make sense of this handwriting, but if you have any experience reading through E. Pauline Johnson's writing, this is very similar. You kind of, I think, get better at it over time. So with Johnson's desired title, Legends of the Capilano, we can assume that Pauline was describing the people of the Capilano Reserve. And those are members of the Squamish Nation, like Chief Joe and Mary Capilano, of course, of the same name, who called that area of North Vancouver at Capilano Creek their home. So this letter would play a key role in justifying the change in the title of the book to Legends of the Capilano, which I was able to do last year in the updated edition of the book that I published with the University of Manitoba Press. Now, I don't have time really to go through the detailed publishing history that I normally would like to do, but if you read the updated edition, you will be able to learn more about that. In the new edition, I provide this detailed history, but I just wanted to address a few key things that I learned from the collections at McMaster. So the first edition pictured on the left, published in 1911, you'll notice that while the cover of the first edition features that embossed image of a Plains Indian chief, this image does not represent Chief Capilano, nor does it represent the Squamish Nation. It instead sort of has this effect of constructing a stereotypical Indigenous figure to represent the legend stories. Now, in that same letter from Evelyn Johnson to James Goulet, Evelyn also writes about the cover image, quote, "The pictured head on the cover is merely a conventional drawing of an Indian's head. Many persons think it is a picture of Chief Joe Capilano, who related the legends to my sister," unquote. Now moving a few images over, though not in McMaster's collections, I wanted to just briefly mention the 1913 editions, and these are held at SFU's Special Collections Library. So in the middle left, this is one of the 1913 editions, and the copy beside that is the same edition, but a copy that is unique in that it has had an additional board glued over top, a hand-painted board glued over top of the original paper binding. So giving it this new cover and new title, Legends of Capilano. So this is a kind of, a gesture that perhaps suggests that the alternative title that Johnson actually wanted for the collection was, more widely known than just in that correspondence between Evelyn and Goulet. In 1914, Johnson's former editor at the Province newspaper, Lionel Makovsky, and this person is actually the person who had been left the copyright of Legends of Vancouver in Johnson's final will. So Makovsky transferred the copyright of Legends of Vancouver over to McClelland, Goodchild, and Stewart Limited. So that would go on to become McClelland and Stewart. So in there, once M&S had control over this book, they released a slightly newly redesigned edition in 1914, and then in 1922 released the copy that you see on the right there, featuring illustrations by a group of 7 artists, J.E.H. MacDonald. And this edition would go through many printings. The 1961 redesign of Legends coincided with the centennial of Johnson's birth, but for this edition, McClelland and Stewart would significantly shorten Johnson's original author's foreword. So this was a section at the front of the book that she had written that was important in that it framed the legends and was written in Johnson's own words, where she acknowledged Chief Capilano as the source of many of her stories. So in this 1961 edition, that important piece was moved to the back cover. John McClelland of McClelland, Goodchild, and Stewart. He would then transfer the company to his son, Jack McClelland. So Jack McClelland of McClelland and Stewart Publishing. So there are the E. Pauline Johnson collections, the McClelland and Stewart collections, and then also separately the Jack McClelland collections. But because I was visiting for so long, I could go through all of these things. So something that I learned by going through the Jack McClelland collections was that Lionel Makovsky, who had held copyright of legends after Pauline's death, had actually written to McClelland and Stewart proposing to create an educational children's edition of Legends of Vancouver. So I have here a letter written to McClelland and Stewart in 1922, where Makovsky writes, quote, "I can imagine an Arthur Rackham making an extraordinarily fine edition for children. I think that there might be something in this, but instead of the legends being rewritten, their impression would be stamped by the illustrations. Perhaps for children between 8 and 12, the personal touches between Miss Johnson and Chief Capilano and others of her tillicums, that's the Chinook word for friend, might be omitted. It may be possible to rewrite the stories without losing the poetry and atmosphere, but I am a little doubtful." Now, also included in this letter to John McClelland, so before Jack McClelland, his father, John McClelland, owned this publishing house. Also included was a prototype foreword to this new children's edition, which Makovsky had imagined retitling as Indian Fairy Tales. Now, I bring this up because in future editions of Legends, in kind of the front matter, various editors and publishers would likewise use terms like fairy tales and folklore to describe the Legends of Vancouver stories. These terms are inaccurate and misleading when it comes to describing stories that draw on Indigenous traditional knowledge. So this proposed adaptation never ended up happening, but in recent years, there have been several children's book adaptations of some of the Legends of Vancouver stories. So after spending all of these years researching this book and then using what I learned in the archives at McMaster, I was able to publish an updated edition of Legends last year with the University of Manitoba Press. So just briefly, the new edition, of course, has been retitled, honoring Johnson's intended title, acknowledges Joe and Mary Capilano as co-authors alongside Johnson for the first time. So note that the names appear on the cover, and also they're part of the book's cataloging information. So that's how the books are categorized, in the library system. This book, of course, also was produced in consultation and collaboration with descendants of Joe and Mary Capilano as well. So the Matthias family are members of the Squamish Nation, and they have written the new foreword to this book and have been involved in the publication of this new edition with me since 2017. I've written detailed biographical entries and included photographs of both Joe and Mary Capilano. So that's sort of, the first time that they have been given the same space in that front matter that Johnson has always occupied. This new edition includes 5 additional stories that were narrated by Mary Capilano. So ones that, as I said earlier, appeared in that American periodical, so that they weren't chosen for the Legends of Vancouver volume because they didn't appear in the Vancouver newspaper. And then this edition also includes interviews that I conducted with Mohawk scholar Rick Montour and Squamish archaeologist Rudy Reimer. So these are 2 Indigenous experts that are reflecting on the legacy of this book in their home communities. And most importantly, all of the royalties from the sale of this book are being donated to the Chief Joe Matthias BC Aboriginal Scholarship Fund. So I'm not personally taking any royalties for the sale of this book. And the fund that proceeds are being donated to is named after the late Chief Joe Matthias, and the fund supports First Nations students across British Columbia to pursue their dreams of post-secondary education. So moving on now to another project that I have been privileged to be involved with using materials from the McMaster archives, and this relates to Métis author Maria Campbell's 1973 autobiography, Halfbreed. And just a note to viewers that I will be mentioning sexual assault in this part of my presentation. In Halfbreed, Campbell tells the story of her life growing up in extreme poverty in northern Saskatchewan. She describes her move out west to BC and Alberta, and she describes her struggles with drug addiction and attempted suicide, and all of these things that eventually led to the decision to write a book about her life. In this book that was published by McClelland and Stewart, it was a huge success. And for Indigenous readers, and especially for Métis readers, this book was really important in that it represented and celebrated their existence in print. The book was also important for settler or non-Indigenous readers because it provided an eye-opening account of the realities of life for many Indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, despite the book's huge success and response from readers, it was not known widely until recently that a key part of Campbell's life story had been removed by publishers without her permission. And this was a piece of the story that really would change the entire story. The missing piece described Campbell's experience of being sexually assaulted by members of the RCMP at the age of 14. In a 1989 interview with German scholar Hartmut Lutz, Campbell mentions this missing piece. So Campbell, quote, "However, a whole section of the book was taken out that was really important, and I had insisted it stay there. And that was something incriminating the RCMP. Lutz, who decided to take it out? Campbell, the decision was made by the publisher without consulting me. Lutz, so you didn't know until it came out? Campbell, it was in the galley proofs, and when the book came, it was gone," unquote. Now, in April 2017, while at an international literary conference in Dublin, Ireland, my research colleague, Deanna Rader, who's Cree Métis, and I had an opportunity to meet Maria Campbell, which I never imagined would happen in my lifetime. Having read this interview with Lutz and other accounts referencing a missing piece to Campbell's autobiography, we asked for Campbell's permission to seek out the Halfbreed manuscript in the McClelland and Stewart archives at McMaster. So with her blessing, I would look for and I would find this missing piece in the archives 6 months later. So during my visit, and this was the same trip where I found Evelyn Johnson's important letter about the true title for Legends of Vancouver, I located these 2 pages, crossed out with red X's when reviewing the manuscript files relating to Halfbreed. So this was part of the McClelland and Stewart manuscript files. I'm not going to read these pages aloud, but they describe in detail Campbell's sexual assaults by members of the RCMP, as she had originally written it in the 1970s and intended to include in her published autobiography. I knew right away that these pages were extremely significant and that they would need to be handled with care. A few months after visiting the archives, my research colleague and I arranged to meet with Campbell at her home in Saskatoon. We presented Campbell with gifts of tobacco and sweetgrass and showed her images of the missing manuscript pages. She encouraged us to write about our findings, and with her permission and ongoing consultation, we published an article in an academic journal, Canadian Literature, in May of 2018. Now, while uncovering these missing pages themselves was significant, I was also able to learn by going through the McClelland and Stewart archives to learn more about the context of this decision. So looking through the publishing correspondence files relating to Halfbreed. So these were also within the McClelland and Stewart collections. Now note that I use this phrase RCMP incident in quotations because the quote-unquote incident is how Campbell's sexual assault was referred to in correspondence at MNS. So here are a few key points. So there was a bit of an editorial tug of war around these pages, in that Campbell would include them in her draft pages, and then her editors would remove them in their edits and send the file back to her with the pages taken out. And then she would put the pages back in her next revision. According to the correspondence files, the editors at McClelland and Stewart mainly feared that publishing Campbell's account of sexual assault might lead to legal action by the RCMP, which would then prevent the book from being sold, and McClelland and Stewart, would potentially lose a lot of money. And at that time, the company was already in deep financial trouble. By early 1972, McClelland and Stewart had agreed to take on Campbell's book, with, according to correspondence from Jack McClelland, significant revisions that needed to still be done. The RCMP pages were first deleted by editor David Barry in September of 1972. Campbell then added the pages back in November of 1972. And in a letter to Jack McClelland, the editor David Barry writes, quote, "She has reinserted the Mountie rape incident in the revised manuscript. Her own lawyer apparently thinks this is okay, but as we might feel differently about it, I thought you should know." The pages were removed again by the editor in December of 1972. And you can see the image here on the slide, where the editing notes read pages 103 to 104, Mountie incident cut. So this was the final removal before the book went to press. So this is just a small example of how the correspondence relating to this book allows us to follow the timeline of editorial intervention. And it also underlines the extent to which Campbell was not consulted or given voice on editorial decisions relating to her own autobiography. So briefly, to go through the publishing history of this book, starting from the top left, we have the first edition by McClelland and Stewart, 1973, the first US edition by Saturday Review Press, also in 1973. And note that Campbell really disliked the cover for this book and tried to have it changed. The publishing correspondence at McMaster includes a letter in which Campbell states, quote, "The jacket is gross. I hate it. Is there anything you can do to have it changed? It looks like a moldy body slowly creeping out of a grave. I find it very disturbing and would appreciate having it changed," unquote. Unfortunately, the publisher did not listen. Next, we have the Seal Books edition. So that's part of the McClelland and Stewart and Bantam line, published in 1979, so a kind of mass market paperback. Next, the Alberta Heritage Collection in 1979, and this was part of an initiative to raise awareness about Indigenous heritage in Alberta and Canada. Next, the second US edition, published with the University of Nebraska Press in 1982. And this was a very kind of slim, basic edition, likely for students. And then back to the left again, bottom, the German edition, 1983. This was published by a Munich-based feminist publishing house. 1983 also, the Goodread Biographies edition. This was an imprint of the publisher Formac Publishing, who would, in the next image, take over publication between 1984 and 2019. And note that the 2019 edition published by Formac also included a notice to readers at the front. And this mentioned the missing pages and the article that Deanna and I had written about them. Now, I go through this publishing history again in much more detail in my dissertation. But I wanted to touch on one interesting observation briefly. So notice that you're seeing in all these different titles, some titles that are hyphenated and some that are not. So though Campbell titled the book Halfbreed without a hyphen, it has also historically appeared under the hyphenated title Halfbreed, and with no explanation for this variation, likely a stylistic choice. When I asked Campbell about the hyphenation, she explained that it was very important to her that the term "not" be hyphenated. She said, quote, "That was the spelling on the first published edition, which also came from a great deal of conversation with Jack. He didn't understand why it was so important, but he agreed to it," unquote. Now, the hyphenated term half-breed was used often by the federal government throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries to refer to Métis people. So we might consider Campbell's refusal to use that state-sanctioned terminology in her book as part of a larger form of Métis resistance and reclamation of the word. Now, in 2019, and as a direct result of the archival research that took place at McMaster, Campbell was able to release an updated and restored edition of Halfbreed published with McClelland and Stewart. This includes a new introduction written by Métis scholar Kim Anderson, a new afterword written by Campbell, and of course also includes the 2 missing pages returned to their former place in the book. Now, it's significant that Campbell decided to return to McClelland and Stewart to republish this book. She could have republished this book anywhere. So the same publisher where it all started. And she explains that in the afterword of this new edition, she talks about this concept of Kwaskastahsowin, of what it means to put things to right. And that part of giving McClelland and Stewart, this opportunity to republish the book in a good way is what that means in the publishing world, to give them an opportunity to set things right, to move forward in a good way. Now, going back to that 1989 interview with Hartmut Lutz, Campbell was asked if she would ever rewrite her groundbreaking autobiography. And she responded, quote, "Yes, someday. I don't think I'd make changes. What I would do with the book is I would only put in that piece that was taken out," unquote. And that's exactly what she has done with the updated and restored edition of Halfbreed, using those missing pages from the McMaster archives, telling her story the way she had always intended. Now, I'd like to conclude by expressing my sincere thanks to the staff of the William Reddy Division of Archives and Research Collections at McMaster, and especially to those who were there in 2017 and who made my month-long research trip just so amazing and memorable. I would also like to thank McMaster University Library and alumni for giving me the opportunity to share my research in the Archives Alive series today. And then finally, I would like to acknowledge Maria Campbell, who gave me permission to share the images of the missing pages for today's talk, and whose kindness and ongoing support really mean everything. I've included on this slide a link to a digital publishing timeline that I made as part of my PhD dissertation. And this uses the publishing correspondence at McMaster. And it goes into so much more detail about the decisions around the removal of those pages than I could possibly go into today. So please take a look at this. And if you have any questions, there's my email. And thank you so much for listening.